Sir, they're insulting you. The sentence landed in the middle of the ballroom like a dropped glass, sharp enough to cut through the laughter, the music, and the low hum of million-dollar conversations. For a moment, nobody moved. Then dozens of heads turned toward the source of the voice. Naomi Carter stood beside a table draped in white linen, a silver tray balanced carefully in her hands. Her black server uniform blended into the background of the Grand Meridian Hotel, exactly the way waitresses were expected to. Invisible, silent, easy to ignore, but not anymore. The crystal chandeliers hanging 30 feet above the ballroom scattered warm light across polished marble floors, and rows of executives dressed in tailored suits worth more than Naomi's monthly rent. At the center of it all sat Charles Kensington, one of the most recognizable real estate investors in New York. His silver watch caught the light as he slowly lowered his wine glass. Around him sat a delegation of Chinese investors preparing to finalize what financial reporters were already calling the business deal of the year. Nearly $500 million. Cameras waited outside. Lawyers filled the perimeter of the room. Advisors hovered nearby with tablets and folders. Everything had been planned down to the minute. Everything except Naomi. Charles stared at her for several seconds before a smile crept across his face. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had spent decades being the smartest person in every room he entered. "Excuse me?" he asked. Naomi swallowed carefully. Her heartbeat thudded against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. "The men at the far end of the table," she said. "They're not saying what everyone thinks they're saying." A few guests exchanged confused glances. Someone chuckled. Another person rolled his eyes. Charles leaned back comfortably in his chair. "And you know this because?" The room waited. Naomi looked briefly toward the Chinese delegation. One older investor had stopped smiling entirely. Another stared at her with visible curiosity. "Because I understand Mandarin," she replied. The laughter came immediately. It spread across the ballroom in waves. A woman near the stage covered her mouth. Two executives shook their heads. Even some of the hotel staff standing along the walls looked uncomfortable. Charles laughed loudest of all. "You understand Mandarin?" he repeated. "That's incredible." His amusement drew even more attention. Nearby conversations stopped. More guests turned to watch. Naomi could feel every eye in the room pressing against her. The weight of being judged before she had spoken another word. Charles reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. The motion instantly captured everyone's attention. He uncapped a pen, scribbled a number, then held the check high enough for those nearby to see. $100,000. The room erupted with excitement. "I'll make you a bet," Charles announced. $100,000 says you can't hold a real conversation in Mandarin for even 60 seconds. The crowd loved it. Some laughed. Others pulled out phones. A few investors exchanged uncomfortable looks, but remained silent. Naomi stood perfectly still. The silver tray felt heavier in her hands now. Across the room, the soft notes of a piano drifted through the ballroom, strangely calm against the growing tension. Charles folded the check and placed it on the table in front of him. "Well," he asked, "what do you say?" Naomi slowly set the tray down. The metal touched the table with a quiet click. Then she looked directly at the Chinese investors. And for the first time that evening, one of them rose from his chair. The older investor adjusted his glasses and studied Naomi with an expression that no longer carried amusement. The ballroom remained frozen around them. Even the waitstaff standing along the walls seemed afraid to breathe too loudly. Charles Kensington folded his arms confidently, certain that the next 60 seconds would end exactly the way he expected. Naomi met the investor's gaze and answered him in fluent Mandarin. The words flowed naturally, smooth and precise, carrying the rhythm of someone who had spoken the language for years rather than memorized a few phrases. A murmur swept through the room. The investor responded. Immediately, Naomi answered again without hesitation. Another question followed. Then another. Within moments, the two were engaged in a conversation so rapid that most people in the ballroom could not follow a single sentence. Charles's smile began to fade. Across the table, several members of the Chinese delegation exchanged surprised looks. One woman quietly lowered her tablet. Another leaned forward in her chair. The conversation continued for nearly a minute. Then two. Then three. Naomi remained calm. Her posture never changed. Her voice never shook. Finally, the older investor smiled, and switched to English. Your accent is excellent, he said. Not textbook Mandarin. Regional. The room grew even quieter. Naomi nodded politely. I spent several years in Shanghai. The investor's eyebrows lifted. That explains it. Charles cleared his throat. Interesting, he said. Very impressive. But the confidence in his voice sounded thinner now. Naomi could see it. So could everyone else. The investor glanced toward the stack of contracts waiting on the table. His smile disappeared. Since she understands Mandarin, he said carefully, perhaps she should tell you what was actually being discussed before she interrupted. A ripple of uncertainty moved through the room. Charles laughed awkwardly. I think my legal team has everything under control. Naomi remained silent. The investor continued looking at her. Go ahead. For a brief moment, Naomi considered walking away. She was a waitress. This was not her meeting, not her money, not her problem. But then she remembered the phrase she had overheard only minutes earlier. A phrase buried beneath polite smiles and carefully chosen translations. She looked at Charles. You believe this agreement creates an equal partnership, she said. It does not. Several executives immediately frowned. One attorney reached for the contract. Charles's expression hardened. What exactly are you implying? Naomi took a slow breath. The warm glow of the chandeliers reflected across the polished table between them. I am saying that one of the translated provisions does not mean what your team thinks it means. The attorney stopped, turning pages. The room became still again. Somewhere in the distance, a piano note lingered in the air. Naomi looked directly at the contract. Then she pointed toward a section buried deep within the document. Page 37, she said quietly. That is where the problem begins. The attorney's fingers tightened around the edge of the contract. For several seconds, nobody moved. The ballroom that had been buzzing with conversation only minutes earlier now felt strangely small, as if every person inside had been pulled into the same moment. Charles Kensington leaned forward slowly. The confidence that usually filled his face had been replaced by irritation. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone wearing a server's name tag. Page 37, he repeated. You interrupted a $500 million negotiation because of one page. A few guests laughed nervously, grateful for any excuse to release the tension building in the room. Naomi remained composed. She had spent years learning that the loudest voices were not always the most powerful. Sometimes the truth spoke quietly. The attorney opened the contract and flipped through the thick stack of documents. The soft sound of turning paper echoed across the polished table. Nearby, several executives rose from their seats to get a better view. The Chinese delegation watched without speaking. Their expressions revealed nothing. Charles glanced toward his legal team. Well, he asked. Tell her she is mistaken so we can continue. The attorney did not answer immediately. His eyes moved across the page once. Then again, a small crease formed between his eyebrows. Another lawyer stepped closer. What is it? She asked. He handed her the document. She read silently. The crease appeared on her face as well. Naomi felt dozens of eyes shifting between her and the legal team. The silver tray she had set aside remained untouched on a nearby table. For the first time all evening, she forgot she was supposed to be serving drinks. Charles noticed the exchange, and his patience began to thin. Someone explain what is happening. The female attorney finally looked up. This clause grants dispute resolution authority through an outside governing structure. Charles shrugged. That sounds standard. Not this version. She swallowed. The translated language suggests shared oversight. The original Mandarin wording suggests something very different. The room became silent again. One investor from the Chinese delegation folded his hands together and simply watched. Naomi recognized the look immediately. It was the expression of someone waiting for others to discover what he already knew. Charles sat back in his chair. Different how? The attorney hesitated. If a dispute occurs, operational control shifts almost entirely away from your company. Several executives exchanged alarmed glances. Charles blinked once. That is impossible. I thought so too, the attorney admitted. Until I compared the wording. The warmth seemed to drain from the ballroom. Even the piano player in the corner had stopped. Naomi could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning above them. Charles reached for the contract himself and scanned the page. His jaw tightened. The numbers involved were staggering. Years of expansion, hundreds of employees, decades of work, all connected to the agreement sitting in front of him. Across the table, The older investor finally spoke. Language matters, he said calmly, especially when billions of dollars may depend on a single interpretation. Charles looked up slowly. Then he turned toward Naomi. For the first time since she had spoken, there was no amusement in his eyes, only uncertainty. And before anyone could process what had just happened, one of the Chinese investors stared at Naomi and quietly said a name that caused the color to leave his face. The name hung in the air for a moment, soft enough that most people near the back of the ballroom did not hear it. But Charles did. So did the attorneys standing beside him. Naomi's eyes widened slightly as she looked toward the investor who had spoken. He appeared to be in his late 60s, dressed in a dark suit with a simple silver tie. Unlike the others, he was no longer studying the contract. He was studying her. Professor Lin's student, he said in careful English. A wave of confusion moved across the room. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in years. The investor smiled faintly. I knew I recognized your Mandarin. Charles looked between them. You know each other? The investor nodded. Not personally, but in Shanghai, there were stories. Several members of the delegation exchanged glances. Naomi wished the floor would swallow her whole. She had spent years trying to leave that chapter of her life behind. Charles leaned forward. What stories? The investor ignored him and continued looking at Naomi. You studied under Professor Lin Wei. It was not a question. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Yes. The investor exhaled slowly. One of the most respected experts in international commercial language. The room grew quiet once again. Even those who understood little about international business could hear the respect in his voice. Charles glanced toward his attorneys. None of them looked comfortable. Naomi folded her hands in front of her. That was a long time ago. Not long enough for people to forget, the investor replied. The chandeliers cast warm reflections across the glass table as whispers spread through the crowd. A waitress. A student of one of the most respected language scholars in Asia. The contrast seemed impossible. Charles stared at Naomi's hotel name tag, as though it suddenly made no sense. If that is true, he said carefully, then why are you serving drinks? The question landed harder than he intended. Naomi remained silent for several seconds. The answer was simple, but simplicity did not make it easy. Life changed, she said quietly. Charles frowned. That is all. Naomi gave a small smile that never reached her eyes. Sometimes that is enough. Nobody laughed this time. The investor looked toward the contract again. Your legal team nearly missed a very expensive mistake. One of Charles's attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Another closed the binder completely. The reality of what had almost happened was beginning to settle over the room like a heavy fog. Charles slowly stood from his chair. For the first time all evening, he did not look like the most powerful person in the ballroom. He looked like a man trying to understand something that did not fit his assumptions. His gaze returned to Naomi. How did you see it so quickly, he asked. Naomi hesitated. Then she looked toward page 37. Because that clause was not written by accident, she said. I have seen language like that before. The older investor's expression changed immediately. Charles noticed it. Before where? He asked. Naomi took a slow breath. The answer carried years of memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. And when she finally spoke, the room became silent all over again. At the firm that originally created this strategy. The words settled over the ballroom with a weight that seemed impossible for a single sentence to carry. Nobody reached for a drink. Nobody checked a phone. Even the reporters waiting near the entrance had stopped whispering among themselves. Charles Kensington stared at Naomi as if the room had suddenly tilted beneath him. You work there? He asked. Naomi nodded once. The older investor's eyes widened slightly. Several members of the Chinese delegation exchanged quiet looks that carried more meaning than words. Charles looked back toward his attorneys. What firm is she talking about? One of them swallowed. There are only a handful of consulting groups known for developing cross-border language structures like this. Naomi looked down briefly. The polished marble floor reflected the chandelier light in soft golden patterns. She had spent years avoiding conversations about her past, years convincing herself that chapter was over. Yet here she was, standing in a ballroom wearing a waitress uniform while executives discussed a life she had buried long ago. I joined after graduate school, she said quietly. My team specialized in reviewing international agreements before they were signed. A low murmur spread across the room. Charles blinked. You reviewed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Sometimes more. The answer came so calmly that it almost sounded ordinary. It was not. Charles rubbed his jaw slowly. Every assumption he had made about her during the evening was beginning to collapse. He looked at the $100,000 check still sitting on the table between them. It suddenly felt insignificant compared to everything he was learning. Then why leave? The question came out softer than before. Naomi hesitated. The investor who had recognized her remained silent, allowing her to answer in her own time. Outside the ballroom windows, Manhattan glittered against the night sky. Thousands of lights stretched into the distance. Naomi stared toward them for a moment. My mother became ill, she said. I came home to take care of her. Nobody interrupted. After she passed away, I tried to return to consulting. Her voice remained steady, but something in her eyes shifted. The industry had moved on. The gap in my resume became longer. Interviews became harder. Eventually, I needed work that paid immediately. The silence that followed felt heavier than any speech. Charles looked down. Across the room, several executives suddenly found the table far more interesting than meeting her gaze. Naomi was not angry. She was not accusing anyone. Somehow that made the truth harder to hear. The older investor folded his hands. Professor Lin used to say that talent is easy to find. Character is rare. Naomi smiled faintly. He said a lot of things. A few people laughed softly. The tension eased for only a moment. Then one of Charles's attorneys lifted another document from the stack. His face turned pale. Charles, he said quietly, there is something else. Every eye turned toward him. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Naomi. The language on page 37 is not the only problem. The attorney flipped several pages deeper into the agreement. There is a second clause. The room became still again. Naomi's expression changed immediately. She already knew exactly where he was looking. Naomi's eyes moved to the section the attorney was holding, and the faint smile disappeared from her face. She recognized the language immediately, not because she had read this exact contract before, but because she had spent years studying the patterns hidden inside agreements that looked harmless on the surface. The ballroom seemed unusually quiet now. The earlier laughter felt like something that had happened hours ago instead of minutes. Charles watched Naomi carefully. He was no longer looking at her as a waitress. He was looking at her the way investors look at market signals they almost missed. The attorney adjusted the document under the chandelier light. There is a compensation provision buried in the secondary governance section, he said. At first glance it appears routine. Naomi nodded slowly. But it is not routine. The attorney looked at her. No, a second lawyer stepped closer and scanned the page. Her expression darkened. If performance targets are disputed, the valuation formula changes. Charles frowned. What does that mean in plain English? Nobody answered immediately. The silence itself became an answer. Finally, Naomi spoke. It means the company providing the assets can redefine the value after the agreement is signed. Several executives exchanged alarmed looks. One nearly dropped the folder in his hand. Charles stared at the page. That would shift millions of dollars. Naomi looked directly at him. Potentially much more. The older investor from Shanghai folded his hands and watched quietly. He seemed less surprised than everyone else, as if he had been waiting for the room to catch up. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, tiny streams of rain had begun sliding down the glass. Manhattan's lights blurred behind them, transforming into soft streaks of gold and white. Inside, nobody noticed the weather. Every person was focused on the documents spread across the table. Naomi could feel the atmosphere changing. Earlier, she had been an outsider standing beside a drink cart. Now some of the same executives who had laughed at her were studying every word she said. It was an uncomfortable feeling. Not because she wanted recognition, because she knew how quickly people's opinions changed when money was involved. Charles slowly sat down. The confidence that had defined him all evening had been replaced by concentration. He read page after page while the attorneys continued reviewing the contract. Minutes passed. The ballroom remained silent except for the turning of paper and the distant hum of the air conditioning. Then another attorney stopped reading. My God! The words slipped out before he could stop them. Everyone looked up. There is a third issue. Charles closed his eyes briefly. How many are there? Nobody knew. Naomi stared at the contract. The language was familiar. Too familiar. Piece by piece, she could see the architecture behind it. The structure. The intent. The strategy. It reminded her of conference rooms in Shanghai. Long nights. Endless negotiations. Lessons from Professor Lin. The realization settled heavily in her chest. This agreement had not been assembled by an amateur. Someone highly skilled had designed it. Someone who understood exactly how people overlooked details when they became distracted by opportunity. The older investor suddenly looked at Naomi. You see it now, do not you? Naomi took a slow breath. Her eyes moved to the final pages. Then she nodded. Yes. Charles looked up from the contract. See what? Naomi's gaze remained fixed on the document. I think I know who wrote this. The question lingered in the air. No one interrupted. No one reached for a glass. The ballroom had become something entirely different from the elegant celebration it had been an hour earlier. It now felt like a courtroom where every word mattered. Charles Kensington stared at Naomi, waiting. Around him, attorneys, executives, investors, and reporters stood frozen beneath the glow of the chandeliers. Naomi looked down at the final pages of the agreement. The familiar structure was impossible to ignore now. The layered clauses, the carefully softened translations, the strategic placement of key provisions where exhausted negotiators were least likely to notice them. She had spent years learning how to identify patterns exactly like these. Patterns designed to hide in plain sight. The older investor nodded slowly. He already understood what she had discovered. Who wrote it? Charles asked again. Naomi exhaled quietly. I cannot be completely certain. Charles leaned forward. But her eyes remained on the contract. But there is one person I know who built agreements this way. The room became still. Rain continued sliding down the windows overlooking Manhattan. The city lights shimmered through the glass like distant stars. Naomi swallowed. She had not spoken this name in years. Victor Zhao. Several members of the Chinese delegation immediately exchanged looks. One attorney's face lost color. The older investor closed his eyes briefly as though confirming a suspicion he had already carried. Charles noticed the reaction immediately. Who is Victor Zhao? The attorney beside him answered first. One of the most respected international contract architects of the last 20 years. Another lawyer added quietly. And one of the most controversial. Charles looked back toward Naomi. You worked with him? Naomi nodded once. For 2 years. The room erupted into whispers. Charles stood motionless. The realization was beginning to settle over everyone at once. The waitress standing beside the table had not merely recognized a translation error. She had recognized the signature of one of the most influential minds in international business law. Naomi looked toward the rain-streaked windows. Memories surfaced that she had spent years trying to forget. Endless conference rooms. Long negotiations. Professor Lin's lectures. Victor Zhao's impossible standards. The pressure to notice details that others missed. Victor used to say that people never read what they think they already understand, she said quietly. Several attorneys lowered their eyes. The statement hit too close to home. Charles looked at the agreement again. The contract that had seemed flawless only an hour ago now felt dangerous. Can you prove it was him? Naomi shook her head. Not tonight. Charles's shoulders sank slightly. Then the older investor spoke. Actually, perhaps she can. Every eye turned toward him. He reached into his leather briefcase and removed a thin folder. The movement seemed insignificant until he placed the folder on the table. Then the room fell silent. Because 3 years ago, he said calmly, my company received a proposal using the exact same framework. He opened the folder. The first page became visible. At the bottom sat a familiar signature. Victor Zhao. Charles stared at the document. Then at Naomi. Then back at the signature. The room seemed to stop breathing. But what shocked him most was not the name. It was what he noticed written beneath it. A reviewer listed directly below Victor Zhao. Naomi Carter. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the rain tapping softly against the tall windows overlooking the city. The document remained open on the table, illuminated beneath the warm chandelier light. Charles Kensington stared at the reviewer line as if the words might change if he looked long enough. They did not. Naomi Carter. The same woman who had been carrying drinks less than an hour earlier. The same woman he had publicly challenged in front of an entire ballroom. Slowly, Charles lowered himself into his chair. The movement seemed heavier than before. Around him, executives who had spent years negotiating major transactions looked equally stunned. One attorney removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Another simply stared at Naomi without saying a word. The older investor closed the folder carefully. When this proposal circulated through several firms, he said, many people believed the reviewer would eventually become one of the most influential contract specialists in international finance. Naomi looked away. Compliments had always made her uncomfortable, especially when they referred to a version of herself she no longer recognized. Charles finally broke the silence. You reviewed this? Naomi nodded. Years ago. And nobody here knew? She gave a faint smile. Nobody asked. The answer landed harder than any accusation could have. Across the room, several guests shifted uneasily. The truth was painfully simple. They had seen a waitress and stopped looking further. Charles glanced toward the $100,000 check still resting on the table. It now felt almost absurd. He picked it up slowly. The paper seemed unusually small in his hand. Then he stood. Every eye followed him. Naomi expected another question. Instead, Charles walked around the table and stopped in front of her. The ballroom became perfectly still. I owe you an apology, he said. There was no performance in his voice. No attempt to save face. Just honesty. I judged you before I knew anything about you. Naomi remained quiet. Charles looked briefly toward the contract. And if you had stayed silent tonight, I might have signed away a large part of my company. The attorneys exchanged glances. None of them disagreed. Charles extended the check toward her. A bet is a bet. Naomi looked at the paper. $100,000. More money than many people earned in years. She could feel the attention of every person in the room. The expectation. The curiosity. The anticipation. Slowly, she accepted the check. A few people began to clap. Then more joined in. The applause spread through the ballroom until it filled the room. Naomi stood quietly while the sound echoed around her. She had imagined many things during difficult nights after her mother's passing. This moment had never been one of them. Eventually, the applause faded. Charles smiled faintly. I hope this is not the last time we speak. Naomi looked down at the check, then back at him. It probably should not be. Several people laughed softly. The tension finally eased. Yet before anyone could return to the celebration, one of the attorneys studying the documents suddenly looked up. His expression had changed. Charles, he said carefully, there is something else you need to see. The room immediately fell silent again. The attorney slowly turned the final page and then let out a quiet breath. Everyone waited. Charles Kensington looked at him expectantly, but this time the attorney's expression was different. There was no alarm, no concern, only relief. It is clean, he said. The remaining sections are exactly what they appear to be. A wave of tension seemed to leave the room all at once. Several executives sat back in their chairs. Others exchanged exhausted smiles. The storm had passed. Charles glanced at Naomi and shook his head softly. You saved us months of litigation, years of complications, and possibly hundreds of millions of dollars. Naomi looked down at the check still resting in her hand. The paper felt strangely unimportant now. Around her, conversations slowly resumed. Glasses clinked. People began speaking again. Yet the atmosphere had changed. The room that had once dismissed her now treated her with a respect she had never asked for. The older investor gathered his documents and approached Naomi. Professor Lin would be proud of you, he said. Naomi smiled gently. He would probably tell me I missed something. The investor laughed. Yes, he probably would. For the first time that evening, Naomi laughed too. A quiet, genuine laugh that seemed to erase years of weight from her shoulders. Minutes later, guests began leaving the ballroom. Reporters hurried to file stories. Attorneys discussed revisions. Executives exchanged business cards beneath the fading glow of the chandeliers. The grand celebration had become something else entirely. A lesson nobody expected to learn. Charles walked beside Naomi as she prepared to leave. They stopped near the ballroom entrance where the city lights shimmered beyond the glass doors. What are you going to do with the money? He asked. Naomi looked at the check for a moment. Then she folded it carefully. There is a scholarship fund at the community college where my mother used to volunteer. Charles nodded. That sounds like her daughter. Naomi smiled. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sidewalks glistened beneath the streetlights, reflecting gold and silver across the pavement. She stepped through the hotel doors and into the cool night air. Behind her, the Grand Meridian Hotel stood tall against the Manhattan skyline. Inside, deals would continue. Investors would negotiate. Executives would chase opportunities. The world would keep moving. Naomi paused at the edge of the sidewalk and looked back through the glass. She could still see the ballroom from a distance. The same room where laughter had once followed her. The same room that had fallen silent when the truth finally spoke. Through the window, Charles remained standing near the entrance. Their eyes met briefly. He gave a small nod. Naomi returned it. Then she turned and walked away. Her waitress name tag caught a final reflection from the city lights before disappearing into the night. Earlier that evening, people had looked at that name tag and believed they understood who she was. Now they knew better. The wind moved gently through the street. Traffic hummed in the distance. Somewhere above the skyline, the clouds were finally beginning to break. And for the first time in many years, Naomi felt something she had almost forgotten. Not victory, not recognition, peace.